Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. With just 3 weeks to go for the budget, we ask, what are the prospects for the economy? The government is convinced because GDP is back at pre-pandemic levels that the country is about to witness several years of accelerated growth. But a paper recently published by Foreign Affairs and due to be published soon by Seminar raises serious questions and doubts. And one of its authors is this government's first chief economic advisor, and he's clearly in a position to know. Joining me now to share his doubts and concerns is Arvind Subramanian, presently a senior fellow at Brown University. Dr. Subramanian, although I want to talk at length about your paper on India's stalled rise, recently published in Foreign Affairs and due to be published soon in India by Seminar, let me start with something you said in an earlier presentation to the Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research. You said in 2019-20, the last pre-pandemic year, India's economy didn't grow by 4%, as the government has claimed, but in fact it shrank. What brings you to this conclusion, and by how much did the economy shrink?
Yeah, first of all, thanks, Karan. Thanks for having me on the show. So starting with 2019-20, the official numbers showed a big deceleration in growth, to be fair. And so that deceleration seemed to be plausible enough for people not to focus on the level of growth that it was showing. And the reason for saying why I have my doubts about that number is that if you look at almost every other major macro reliable indicator that we have, all of them are in negative territory. So for example, if you take credit growth in the economy, it's about -2%. If you take export growth, it's -2%. If you take investment growth, it's -5%. If you look at the IIP, it's in negative territory. If you look at imports, which is probably a very good signal of the state of the economy, again, minus. So the bottom line is that all the other indicators are all showing that the economy was in negative growth territory. And that's why that 4% seemed a little bit implausible. Now, you're asking me how negative it was. The honest answer is I don't know, because one has to do this a little bit more carefully. But that it was nowhere close to the 4% that the official numbers were showing, and that it was likely in negative growth territory. Of that, I think I can be reasonably confident.
So in a nutshell, we can't say by how much the economy shrank, but because every other indicator shows negative growth, it's almost certain that GDP would have shrunk. The 4% figure is really questionable and hard to believe.
One way of thinking about it, Karan, is that, one of the puzzles about the COVID year, 2020-21, if you look at the G20 performance, G20 countries, i.e. the major other economies, India's decline in growth was the greatest. The decline in India's growth in 2020-21, the first COVID year, was much greater than in every other G20 country, matched only by the UK, something like -11%. So the question was, why did COVID impact India disproportionately, right? Because yes, our lockdown was pretty serious, but our fiscal response was not bad compared to the other countries. So why did it, have such an adverse impact? And the answer is that even going into COVID, the economy was so weak. That's why the COVID impact was much greater than everywhere else. So that's additional kind of evidence that the economy was already very weak going into COVID.
Now, connected to this is your long-held belief that India's GDP calculation, according to the new series, is faulty and misleading. You believe it tends to overstate growth. Briefly, can you explain what are your concerns about the new series of GDP calculation?
So, without getting too technical, Karan, you see, essentially what happened is before 2011-12, there was a certain way of calculating GDP. After 2011-12, and I think this was in good faith, not a politically whatever, they changed the methodology in two ways. They went from tried and trusted methodologies to new methodologies, and they went from tried and tested ways or data sources to new data sources. And that really was the reason why we got all these anomalies. And the manifestation of that, again, I don't want to get too technical, the manifestation of that was really a bigger, a generalized form of what I just said, that if you look at every other indicator of growth, exports, imports, credits, profits, taxes, etc., they showed a very large decline after 2011-12, but GDP growth, showed a very, very high increase. So that decoupling between all the other major indicators and the official GDP number, in a way that was not the case before 2011-12, is the manifestation of what perhaps went wrong in the 2011-12 revision.
So in a nutshell, again, you have serious concerns about the GDP figures that come out at the moment under the new series. You aren't totally convinced of their accuracy.
I would put it in a more measured way that whereas before 2011-12 under the old series, I was confident, one could be confident that it was being measured well because it correlated with all the other indicators that we think, measure similar things. After 2011-12, I don't think I have the same confidence in those numbers.
All right. Against this background, let's, Dr. Subramanian, now talk about the paper recently published by Foreign Affairs and which is due to be published soon in India by Seminar magazine. Essentially, that paper punctures the government's confidence that the economic recovery we have seen in the last year means that India is poised for accelerated growth in the years ahead. And your doubts arise out of what you call India's policy software. So can you begin by explaining what does policy software mean in this context?
Yeah, Karan, by definition, when you use the word software, there is an implicit, set off against hardware, right? These are the two, obviously the two are related. So let me, before we launch into my definition of software, I think it's useful to have a bit of background to examine whether, how we're going to do when we come out of COVID. If our analysis is right, then we had basically after 2011-12, we've had almost a decade of fairly weak economic performance. So for about 8 to 10 years, the economy was chugging along and that's the background to this, and that's what we had. But then, to be fair, in the most recent period, the optimism is based on, I would say, 2 or 3 important things. And I'm going to come to software in just a second. One, we know that, the stock market is very buoyant. That feeds optimism. Recently, export performance, India has done well. India is gaining market share. Revenues have done quite well. And of course, there's all this buzz about the unicorns, the rise of unicorns. So there is a segment of the Indian economy which uses finance, cheap finance, uses technology, uses India's talent, and it seems to be surging. Ola and all these companies are examples of that. So there is a basis to the optimism, which is this. But I think the deeper basis for the optimism is, in fact, that the hardware of the economy, a lot of progress has been made, for which both this government, building on the achievements of previous governments, deserves a lot of credit. Now, the hardware has 3 components, Karan. One, physical infrastructure. It began under the Vajpayee government, Golden Quadrilateral, etc. Under UPA-1, we had a lot of airports, roads being built. And this government has, built on that and, continued this building of the physical infrastructure, roads, ports, etc. Second is the digital hardware. I think it's fair to say, again, Aadhaar, etc., began under the previous government, but this government has taken to another level. There's the unified payment interface. There's the JAM Trinity Jan Dhan Aadhaar Mobile. And I think that is, in fact, the rise of the unicorn is based on that digital hardware, which I think is also final piece of the hardware, which I think is distinctively this government's and the major achievement, is what I call the new welfareism, i.e., this government under this prime minister, they have essentially the public provision of essential private goods and services, cooking gas, toilets, bank accounts, housing, and now, of course, water and cash. These are all, tangible benefits that this government claims, with some evidence in the data, has claimed that it has delivered to the poor. And this has benefited the welfare of these people. So, and I think that, the popularity of this government rests to some extent on success in providing. So it's this hardware that underlies, I think, the deeper optimism, which I think we have doubts about, because we think that, there is a whole other component, which is software. And what do we mean by that? We mean basically a kind of understanding of how policy works, how policy is made, the conditions you create for investors, the integrity of the data, the inclusiveness of decision-making, the generation of trust for investors, the stability and consistency of policy. All those go into software, and it's that we have doubts about.
Absolutely. You made a very important distinction between hardware and software. Hardware comprises, as you said, three things. It comprises, to begin with, roads, ports, railways, bridges. It comprises digital India, the digital structure, which is essential with Aadhaar and the JAM Trinity. And the welfareism of this government, the provision of public goods to individuals who earlier didn't have them. There, the government has succeeded. And because the government has done well, it's created an impression, or maybe even an illusion, of confidence that the economy is growing much better than actually is the case. But the weakness lies, as you said, in software, which is the policies the government is implementing. And that's what I want to focus on, because in fact, your critique in that Foreign Affairs article is entirely to do with the government's software. You write, and I'm quoting you, to understand the problem with India's software, consider the centerpiece of the government's current approach to growth, its industrial policy. It's called Atmanirbhar Bharat, and it has, as you identify in your paper, three prongs: targeted subsidies, a return to protectionism, and non-participation in regional trade agreements. You have serious problems with all three prongs, and I want to take you through them one by one. First, can you tell me, why are targeted subsidies a mistake?
Yeah, see, firstly, I think it's useful to understand, Karan, that this industrial policy is actually very different from the protectionist policies of the past. It's kind of, the spirit is somewhat similar, but in execution and things, it's very different, because the license quota permit Raj, very high tariffs, quantitative restrictions, licensing, all of that. This is actually, it's a more subtle form of intervention in the market, which we call industrial policy. The first prong, as you said, is targeted subsidies. Now, this is what's called the production-linked incentives. And the problem with this is threefold. Now, one is that, and this has been kind of eloquently written about by my predecessor, Shankaracharya, is that when you give these targeted subsidies, there's always going to be discretion. Who gets it? How much do they get? There are going to be implementation kind of challenges. How do you make sure there's not leakage? How do you make sure that people are not gaming the system? So the usual kind of anxieties we have about implementation, that's one. Second is, how do you kind of exit we've always found that when we get into this stuff, people like what they get, firms like what they get, and they're going to do their best to make sure that this kind of thing continues. And therefore, exit from these things is very difficult. It becomes an open-ended commitment, which people game and people third, I think the most important is that these are incentives that are targeted at very capital intensive, technology intensive things. What India needs today is labor intensive exports, labor intensive growth. And, the only sectors, if you look at the allocation of these incentives, a tiny fraction is going to labor intensive sectors. So, is it likely to succeed? But even if it succeeds, are the right sectors going to succeed is the open question.
You raise one more point, in fact, in your Foreign Affairs article. You point out that another aim of the targeted subsidies, the production-linked incentive scheme, is to create what you call national champions. And the ones that the government seems to be focusing on, you point out, are the Adani and Ambani conglomerates. And there you say, I'm quoting you, the government is encouraging an extraordinary concentration of economic power. This could create an oligopolistic economy that will stifle innovation and growth. In other words, you're not expanding, you're concentrating on a few, and that will in turn down the road lead to charges of stigmatized capitalism or crony capitalism.
Yeah, so I think, Karan, I think we should separate out the production-linked incentives, which some of it may be taken advantage by some firms, from the broader approach, which is of creating national champions. And that's where what we call the 2As come in. And you see, after all, remember, to be fair, other countries in the past tried it. I mean, famously, the Korean Chaebol, for example, was based on developing national champions. The Zaibatsus in Japan, similarly, similar strategy. And so it's not without, some logic to it. The problem is 2 or 3-fold. First of all, I think, after all, Geo, for example, has had tremendous successes. It's basically democratized access to the digital world. And so it's been very successful. So that's what I think leads people to believe. What's wrong? They're delivering. It can help the economy as a whole. What's the problem? I think there are 3 maybe big problems with it. One is that the concentration of power that you say, in no democracy is such concentration desirable. But here's what distinguishes this kind of variant of, creating national champions from even the Chaebols and the Zaibatsus, is that if you look at the reach of the 2As in India, if you look at the reach, it's kind of unprecedented. We list in this, there are about 12 to 13 sectors in which, these national champions are present. So the kind of horizontal scope, petrochemicals, telecom, retail, digital, finance, entertainment, media. I mean, this is, the kind of reach which has been, unprecedented. And so we're in completely uncharted waters that we know. Finally, and most, is that even if they do good, what does it do to the competition? We've seen, for example, in the telecom sector, competitors have been squeezed out. We see in the retail sector, competitors are being challenged. We see in the online sector, the kind of regulatory favors that are being done to promote these champions is extracting a cost on the competition. So the broader competitive environment is being affected. Last and most important point I want to say is that when the Koreans did the Chaebols and said, okay, we're going to promote national champions, it came with one very important caveat. They said, we give you the money, but you have to show that you're delivering. And what is the benchmark? The benchmark is export. You have to export. The export discipline stick that came with this was what kind of made this not a bad strategy. In India, the sectors in which these champions are operating are all non-tradable sectors, domestic sectors, which don't feel the wind of foreign competition. And so you don't have that discipline. And that's why your anxieties about creating national champions increases.
So in a nutshell, your concerns are to do threefold. One, this whole process of targeted subsidies is full of discretion, and therefore you will be giving advantage to people without explaining it. That could lead to charges of crony capitalism or stigmatized capitalism. Secondly, it's all happening in areas where the export possibility is close to nil. So you're creating oligopolist control of the domestic economy, leaving it largely in the hands of two conglomerates. And most importantly of all, these are capital-intensive sectors. They will not be creating the employment that is required to give jobs to the 7-8 million that enter the labor market every year. In other words, they may be boosting production in capital-intensive goods, but they're not creating jobs, and India's need is to create jobs. This doesn't meet that purpose. Is that a quick, correct summary of that particular point?
Yeah, I think that's a very fair summary. The only thing I would add is that Atmanirbhar as a strategy has two other components, which is, protectionism.
Let me come to that. I'm coming to that in a moment's time. Because your second problem with Atmanirbhar is in fact to do with what you call protectionism. And you're basically talking about, as your paper says, some 3,200 tariffs since 2014. The government believes that this is actually giving a fillip to domestic industry and believes it's the right way of encouraging them. Why do you believe this protectionism is a mistake?
Well, firstly, remember, Karan, that this is a repudiation of like a 25-year consensus in India that the way forward, and that's what the post-1991 reform showed, that you gradually, not indiscriminately and suddenly, but gradually open up to foreign competition to kind of renounce the license quota Raj. And the truth was, it was very effective in terms of trade and exports. Since the 90s, India's exports have grown gangbusters, and that strategy was helping. So beginning 2017, suddenly the government, I think, repudiated that strategy. And the paper I did with Soumitra Chatterjee shows, tariffs were raised by about 5 percentage points and affected about 70% of India's imports. Now, what's the problem with this? When you raise tariffs, essentially what you're doing is, apart from denying Indian consumers access to better quality, cheaper products, whatever, you make the economy very uncompetitive. In this modern world, if you want to compete, especially in the labor-intensive sectors, you need access to the cheapest inputs. And that means, they should be sourced anywhere. And if you raise tariffs, I think, you're going to get expensive inputs, and, your exports are going to be uncompetitive. Classic example is apparel. If you take Vietnam, for example, the access to imported inputs for the Vietnamese apparel industry is amazing. Very few restrictions, very low tariffs, goods come in and out, and then you're able to export. So once you erect these protectionist walls, your economy risks becoming uncompetitive in a way that we discovered in the old import licensing route.
Okay, so clearly what protectionism does is to make it more difficult and expensive and uncompetitive to export. And that undermines one of the 4 engines that drives growth in the economy. And secondly, I presume it also means that the cost of things that Indians themselves buy goes up because the import component becomes more expensive. And so you end up not only making life more expensive for people like you and me and a lot of others, but you also undermine the capacity of the economy to export. Which brings me then to the third prong, which is your third problem with Atmanirbhar, and that is what you call non-participation in regional trade agreements. Now, the government actually believes that these have worked against India's interest, and therefore, by opting out, we're securing our interests. You actually argue the opposite. So can you explain why is this non-participation a problem?
See, I think essentially, Karan, if you look at, and let me explain what I'm saying with reference to, the most dynamic trade arrangement that India decided to stay out of. It's the, RCEP, it's called RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which essentially brings together all the dynamic countries of Asia, including China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, ASEAN, everyone. Now, if you stay out of this, and by the way, the government had, not unreasonable reasons for staying out, which is basically you have a complicated relationship with China. This agreement is dominated by China, so you want to stay out. So that's kind of the underlying strategic reason for staying out. But the economic costs are not small. So you stay out of this, right? That means your ability to export into these markets is going to be significantly worse than all those other countries that are already participating in these markets. So if an Indian exporter wants to sell into these markets, he's going to be at a disadvantage relative to others because they're going to get preferential market access. So you're staying out of and being disadvantaged in one of the most dynamic markets in the world. That's point one. Point two is that within these markets, what I said earlier, you can buy stuff cheaply, bring it out, and make your exports competitive. You rule out that option as well. And so both in terms of being able to buy and access inputs and the terms that you can access for your exports to these markets is you've basically disadvantaged yourself, and therefore your exports are going to be affected. Now, let me just end on this by saying that if you think about China, for example, it's very interesting. China is kind of turning inward. It's politically, doing all kinds of, repressive things domestically. But when it comes to regional agreements, it is not only participating in them, it is actually, signaling that it wants to participate in more such things. So even a repressive, inward-looking China realizes that, if you want to maintain the export and the trade engine as a source of growth, you need to be part of these, especially the very dynamic ones.
In fact, at this point, you make a very powerful comment about the impact of both protectionism and the refusal to participate in regional trade agreements. You write, and I'm quoting you, at precisely the moment when India has its long-awaited chance to compete with China for the first time as a global manufacturing center, the government is making it harder to integrate the Indian economy into global supply chains. In other words, what the government is doing is almost the opposite of what it should do and what it's needed to do.
So Karan, I think it's a good point you raised, because you see, remember what is happening is, and this is important to understand, right? Capital, capital is fleeing China. Okay, very important to note. Capital is fleeing China for two reasons. There's a long-run reason why capital is fleeing China, because China has become richer, wages have risen, it's become more uncompetitive. So all the labor-intensive activities that China was doing, it's vacating space. And we calculated about $150 billion worth of exports are being vacated for others to occupy. A second reason why capital is fleeing China more recently is because China has basically clamped down on its private sector. So the opportunities in China. Now, when this capital is fleeing, it's looking for alternative destinations. It says, okay, should we go to Vietnam? Should we go to Bangladesh? Should we go to India? That's the calculation. All right. Now, when they look at India and they say, well, it's a potentially good destination, but if we go to India, can we easily access these dynamic markets? If you're in Vietnam, the ability to access this dynamic Asian market is much easier because Vietnam is part of these agreements. But if you come to India and you want to access these markets, you're going to be disadvantaged. So that's kind of the implicit calculation that investors are making. And in that, being out of these agreements is just, you're handicapping yourself, and it's not going to help investment.
Absolutely. And the finance minister and the prime minister may keep on talking about how they are looking to invite and lure into India. capital that is fleeing China, but that capital will be deterred, A, by India's refusal to join preferential trade agreements in the region, and B, by the protectionist tariffs that India is increasing, because now if they come and manufacture in India, the imports they need will cost more. So for two good reasons, rather than attract capital to India, you're deterring them. And therefore, this is, in that sense, counterproductive.
Yeah, but see, I think, Karan, one needs to, remember, governments think through these things. I mean, they're not, kind of, what I think underlies this strategy, which I think is misguided, but there is the rationale I think they think is that the Indian market is so big that they think you erect the tariff barriers, the foreigners will come to service the Indian market. Right? That's the kind of logic of Atmanirbhar Bharat. But I think the simple fact is that the size of the Indian market compared to the size of the global market Indian market is a fraction. That's why this calculation is kind of misguided. In the Indian market might be whatever, let's say $500 billion, which actually is what we calculate, but the global market is $20 trillion. And that's why the calculation is misguided.
Absolutely. No one will forsake 20 trillion for the reach and ability to service $500 billion. But so far, Dr. Subramanian, all the problems we've discussed are connected with India's industrial policy, which, as you say, is the centerpiece of the government's approach to growth. There are, however, other problems that are also deterring India's growth, which you mentioned in your foreign affairs piece, and I want to go through those. There are three at least that you identify, and once again, I'll go through each of them one by one. The first is the quality and integrity of India's official data. I take it this is more than just the manner in which we calculate our GDP. You have a bigger, wider problem with data, don't you?
Yeah. So Karan, I think we should preface this segment of the interview by saying now we're getting into the software, what we call the software problems. Okay. So we're going to discuss, the software problems. The software, we talk about 5 categories of problems. We'll go into each of them. But, the first is data. If you want to make good policy, you have to diagnose it right. If you have to diagnose it right, you have to have the right data. And therefore, having good quality, reliable data is kind of the prerequisite to, the policy software. Now, we've spoken about the GDP as well, but in the context of the pandemic, for example, I mean, what became very, very clear, and if you look at the Indian scientific community has been saying that the data that is necessary for society and country as a whole to react in real time. And that's how it's happening in every other country. Data becomes available, it's put out, 100 researchers they provide inputs. And that's, especially in a pandemic, you need this. And the government has a lot of data, but it's just not been available. And I think that has severely hampered. And this is not my view, it's the view of the Indian scientific establishment. But, there are other things as well. But again, to be fair, I think in one area where the government has done improved matters is in the fiscal accounts. Last year, there was a lot of, before that, lot of off-balance sheet activity. I think the government came clean and did transparently put it on budget. So apart from that one exception on the government data, almost across the board, and the pandemic highlighted that, we don't have, as good data as a complex economy requires. Okay. And I'm not kind of, this is not a theoretical argument. And let me give you one example from personal experience, is that, in 2015, 16, 17, when I was in government, the urgency to act, we have these problems, we need to act. That argument got blunted because, people turned around and said, what's the problem? We're growing at 7%. What is this urgency you're talking about? Right? So the whole political economy, the imperative to act when things are bad is a greater urgency. But if your data are telling you that things are not so bad, you really have, it really affects diagnosis and response.
Absolutely. If you don't have data or you don't make it publicly available and keep it only for a privileged few, people don't know the true state of affairs. And if they don't know the true state of affairs, they can't diagnose the problem. And if they can't diagnose the problem, they can't come up with a solution. Or if they try, they could end up with the wrong solution. Which brings me to the second of the problems that you've identified. And this is to do with the lack of trust, or what you actually call distrust, between the government at the center and the state governments. And you say, as a result, in areas like agriculture, health policy, power, welfare schemes, where they should be working together, they don't. Can you explain this point a little further, please?
Yeah. So, Karan, India is a country today where, and this is something that Mr. Jaitley and I used to talk about very often, that almost every area, both the center have policies affecting that area, the states have policies that affect that area, and therefore, neither the center nor states can act on their own. Whether you take agriculture, you take power, you take whatever. Now, what is particularly kind of, in some ways, I would say sad, and is that, one of the great achievements of this government is to enact the goods and services tax, right? I mean, we can talk about whether it's delivered so far or not, but the goods and services tax, the GST, was a great example of the center coming together with the states, and in the spirit of what we call cooperative federalism, everyone gave up their sovereignty for the collective good. That's what the GST was all about. Now, having done that, this government itself done that, it's kind of not learned the lesson from that and walked away from that. You take agriculture, for example, whatever we may think about the content of the reform, I mean, the fact is that this was a reform that affected many states. So, if you want, from a purely pragmatic point of view, if you want policies to be effective, they're going to be implemented by the states. So, there's no getting away from that. So that's why to act unilaterally is not just in terms of some high principle, but just in terms of pragmatic effectiveness is going to be counterproductive.
Absolutely.
So that's the sense in which I think, you have to work together on almost every sector. And the government did that with the GST, and it's kind of seemed to have lost that lesson.
In fact, you put this in a very pithy way in your piece. You write, and I'm quoting you, policy making can become trapped in a vicious cycle in which a lack of trust on the part of states discourages them from implementing national initiatives properly, thereby in turn eroding the central government's trust and discouraging the central government from consulting the states on the next policy measure. And it becomes a vicious downward spiral. They both distrust each other, and the cooperation that is essential between them to ensure effective implementation of policy is what's undermined. And as a result, that policy doesn't get implemented.
Yeah, and of course, that's true. But also, it's important in another sense as well, right? That, take agricultural reform, for example, right? I mean, say the reform is going to adversely affect, say, a state which is reliant on those policies. So in a democracy, if you want buy-in, it's so one is the principle, one is the effectiveness, but in a democracy, if you want buy-in, and there are going to be costs, you have to compensate states for that, right? That's what we did in the GST. In the GST, the principle was some states were potentially going to lose. And what cooperation also does is to get the political buy-in by doing things like compensating the states. So in multiple ways, this is important.
Okay. Now, the third problem is what you call a lack of continuity or sometimes even contradictions in government policy. And again, I'm going to quote you. You say, the lack of a clear, stable investment framework is the fundamental barrier to convincing international manufacturers leaving China to relocate their operations to India. I think this would be best illustrated if you could give me an example. And perhaps the example would be the way in which the government is proposing to change the rules of its retail policy, which will adversely affect Amazon and Walmart and put off people like them from coming, and yet it's their investment we want to lure.
Yeah, so I think that, whether it's been telecom or, online or retail or even infrastructure, right? I mean, some groups get, preferential access to contracts. So in all of these, if the playing field is not level between all forms of capital, and if you say, some form is more favored than another, then you have a problem. And also remember, it's both, not having a level playing field, and second is the playing field can change. After all, because when we had a certain retail policy, it's based on that policy that some investors said we will come in, and then post facto that policy got changed. So it's a non-level playing field, but also an unstable, you don't know whether you're in or out. And so it's both those things which, so the stability of policy and the level playing field that are very important. Now, Karan, see, I think that, I don't know whether you're going to come to this or not. This is not just the inconsistency that affects international investors. There are also things that affect domestic actors. And let me give you two very important examples. Take agriculture, for example, right? For a long time, we've been saying we want to double farmers' incomes. That's been an ostensible thing. But as soon as agricultural price start rising, the government comes down and slaps export restrictions, stock restrictions. So the farmer doesn't get the benefit of those higher prices. So on the one hand, you say we'll double farmer incomes, we're in favor of farmers, but then you slap on these export controls, the opportunities for farmers to sell are affected. And in fact, finally, for me, one of the most, another very telling example is we have this policy that we want to increase the number of taxpayers in India. We have too many taxpayers. We want to increase taxpayers. But in 2019, we suddenly raised the threshold, the income tax threshold. 75% of those who were potential taxpayers dropped out of the net in one fell swoop. So it's this kind of inconsistency of policy, the lack of level playing field, both for domestic firms, but also for international firms. That's, I think, a deeper problem.
Let me ask you very quickly, and I'll ask you for a short answer. Why is it that governments allow these three problems to continue? A, poor data, which sometimes means that the data is available but not made public. So why does that happen? Secondly, why isn't there not a better attempt to improve trust? Because the government knows that the lack of trust between itself and state governments is undermining the implementation of policy. And thirdly, why is there this inconsistency in terms of the playing field, or the fact that you're changing the playing field after the game is begun? These are all things, whether it's data, whether it's trust, whether it's consistency, that the government is aware of and it can easily tackle. Is it a mindset problem in politicians, or is it in fact that they believe somehow because it's been like this, it's okay?
That's a really tough question to answer, because Karan, you're saying put yourselves in the mind of politicians to answer that question. I think it's a variety of reasons. I think in some cases, you want to kind of send out a certain message, and if the data are inconsistent, you want to. In some cases, maybe you genuinely believe that, what you've done is enough to attract the investment. And, these are all kind of maybe second order issues, are not important enough. And third, maybe to some extent, it gets partially validated. You can look at, after all, you can look at some data and say, look, a lot of, portfolio investment is coming into the economy. See, foreigners are not, been put off by this policy. So it's a combination of things. And then finally, of course, if this is validated in electoral politics, i.e. whatever, then these people say, what are you talking about? The people are happy and therefore these things don't matter. So it's a kind of variety of complicated reasons that lead to this.
Now, Dr. Subramanian, we've been through many reasons why, in fact, there are impediments and obstacles to growth. And all those reasons explain what you believe is unlikely to happen. We will not have accelerated growth over the next few years. Let me add one more reason, which is becoming increasingly apparent in the last few weeks and months. I'm talking about the increasing atmosphere of majoritarianism. You might even call it the outright anti-Muslim prejudice. And certainly in the last few weeks, we've had public calls for genocide. What sort of impact will this have? A, on those foreign investors we're desperate to lure? And secondly, what impact will it have on domestic production as well as domestic entrepreneurship?
Yeah, Karan, social scientists grapple with the consequences of, the lack of social peace, social instability on economic outcomes and economic performance, right? And on investor perception. And really, it's quite a kind of confusing field. But I think we can say one or two things with confidence, right? One is that we know that if there is serious social and political instability, we know it's going to impact long-run investment, the attitude of investors. I think that's absolutely clear. Second, of course, is that the big issue is one of timing, right? We don't know in these things, we know eventually these things take a toll, but we can't really predict when this will happen. Because after all, it's been a case with, autocratic regimes, both in China and historically, that you can actually deliver good outcomes for a very long time, or a long time, if you keep a lid and create a sense of stability. That's happened historically. But I think that, that's playing with, that's dangerous, because at some point when the lid comes off and there is an outbreak of instability, things turn south very quickly. The last point I would add is that, see, in the current international environment, I think investors are affected. I mean, not exclusively or decisively, at the margin, the kind of reputational costs of, going into certain areas, certain regimes is becoming increasingly important. So both objectively, you say, if there's instability, my investments are at risk, but also, even if there isn't instability, what are the reputational costs I pay? So I think that one can be confident in the long run, especially if things turn really bad, there will be consequences, but it's kind of difficult to predict the timing of these things.
Now, we're coming right to the end of this interview, and right at the end of your paper, you say, and I'm quoting, for the Indian economy to achieve its potential, however, the government will need a sweeping new approach to policy, a reboot of the country's software. And when I read your paper, what you're actually suggesting is virtually reversing Atmanirbhar. You say, abandon the national champion strategy in favor of an approach that treats all firms equally. You call for lower trade barriers and greater integration into global supply chains. And you also want policy-making processes to be improved so that we have a stable economic environment in which both manufacturing and exports can flourish. That is a complete reversal of the government's industrial policy. So let me ask, how likely is it that the government will do this?
So, look, I think, Karan, given that this government deserves credit for improving the hardware quite a bit, unless the software also follows, the outcomes are not going to be what India needs. Now, how easy or difficult? In a sense, it is the case. What we are saying, what Josh Feldman and I are saying, is that software is more difficult to change and reverse. You can change a policy. You can say, okay, MSP today is X instead of Y, or even you can even say tariffs can be, brought down or whatever. But the software is something deeper. It's like saying, become more open with data, create a more level playing field, don't favor some over another, be consistent in your policy, consult more, be more inclusive, treat investors, without being erratic. So it's kind of actually, by definition, software is deeper. The benefits are greater if you do it. Equally, the costs are greater if you don't do it, and reversing it, because it's not about changing a few things. It's a kind of fundamental attitude and vision about how you change, about how you run business.
But you put your finger on it. It is a fundamental change in attitude that is required by the government. It's not tinkering with MSP levels and prices. It's a complete rethink of its approach to the economy. In other words, the government has to, at least to itself, if not in public, say, we have followed the wrong approach. Arvind Subramanian has very thankfully pointed out why it's the wrong approach. Now I need to reverse it. They may not say that publicly, but they have to be prepared to do it privately. Are governments prepared to say, we got it almost virtually wrong, we need to reverse everything?
Well, reverse everything is putting it extreme, because after all, the hardware and stuff, the huge.
I'm talking about software.
Yeah, I'm talking software. Yeah, I think, you see, here's the thing. If you're convinced that what you're doing is either working or, likely to work, or even if it's only working in kind of a kind of moderate kind of way, that you're being rewarded electorally for it, it's hard for governments to unless things go really bad, or investors, citizens, etc. react. I think governments generally find it difficult to do this. So you need to have some signal from someone, voters, investors, citizens, for governments to actually be disciplined and kind of chastened into change.
Absolutely. As you say, you either need something from outside that pushes you in the direction of change and makes you realize you've got to do it and bite the bullet, or you need to have a Keynesian mindset, who, like, very famously once said, when facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? You just told the government the facts are not what they think they are. It's time they change their strategy. Let's hope they're listening to you. But right at the very end of your paper, in the last paragraph, you make it quite clear what will happen if the government doesn't change its software. In other words, its strategy. You say there would still be modest growth, but a broader boom that transforms and improves the lives of millions of Indians and convinces the world that India is back would be out of reach. In other words, and I'm putting it in colloquial layman's language, we won't catch up with China. And we want become a developed country where everyone has a decent standard of living. We'll carry on much the same as we are, 4, 5, 6% at best growth. We'll be missing out on the 8 and 9 and 10% we desperately want.
One way of thinking about this, Karan, is that, about 10 years ago, right? I think there was a nice description of India as the world's fastest growing free market democracy. And, 10 years ago, that moniker, that label, had a ring of plausibility about it. You genuinely thought, from about 1980 to 2010, 3 decades, India was growing in the first decade. Really things were, the dynamism was there, exports were growing, jobs were growing. And you had the sense that, you had the sense, to put it somewhat starkly, that the future of India's youth was going to be so much better than anything that happened to the previous generation or the parents. And India's kind of, standing in the world, its stake in standing in the world was going to be really very, very different. I think 10 years on, after the global financial crisis, that optimism that, firstly, whether it's still the world's fastest growing free market democracy, or that the future for a vast majority of the youth, of young people, would be that much better than that of their parents, which we were kind of confident about 10 years ago. I think one cannot have that confidence today that we had, 10 years ago. And that's what I think we need to restore. I think the hardware is there. If we can, complement it with, the kinds of things we've been talking about, then I think, but I don't think we should, it's not a counsel for a complete despair. It's a counsel for, change and correction and improvement.
Absolutely. But if the change and correction and improvement, and let me say, it's not just a minor change, it's a fairly wholesale major change in policy. If that change doesn't happen, what's at stake is not just the present, but India's future. And so my last question, how much time does India have to make the pretty comprehensive software changes that are required? Or is there a cutoff after which it could become too late?
I think, Karan, when people talk about, is there a cutoff or not? I think there is no cutoff. I think basically you have to do it. It's very simple. The earlier you do it, the quicker you do it, the more likely that the outcomes are going to be better. And there's no kind of magic line which says before you can do it, after you can't. Something has to be done on an ongoing basis. But the rule is earlier, quicker, faster for the futures. For the future of our young to improve quicker, better, faster.
Absolutely. The earlier you do it, the more people will benefit quickly. The later you do it, the more people will continue to lose the benefits which you could have given. In other words, a good government acts quickly, changes its policies if need be, because the benefit goes to the country in whose name and for whose goodwill they rule. It is therefore morally incumbent on the government to accept that policies are not working and change them. I hope, as the first chief economic advisor of this government, you're being heard, because what you have delivered is a very strong note of warning. Do not expect, if nothing changes, accelerated growth over years as the government keeps claiming will happen. Instead, you will carry on with 4 and 5%, fail to fulfill your potential, fail to provide a better life to the Indian people. And that is a moral compulsion on any government anywhere in the world. I thank you, Dr. Subramanian, for this. I hope people are listening. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you, Karan.